As you all know, we are joining you today as representatives from Poligon Education Fund. We're a national nonpartisan organization dedicated to amplifying Muslim American voices on Capitol Hill. Guided by values of peace, justice, and pluralism, we seek to accomplish this through training, education, and advocacy. And I won't talk too much about Polygon. You can find more information on policy issues that we work on, educational resources, and opportunities for collaboration on our website at polygonnational.org. Next slide, please.
It's there.
Yep, Jazakallah khairan, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us today. By just joining today, you've already taken a positive step forward in becoming an effective advocate for change in our society. So congratulations and thank you. To briefly let you know what's in store today, we'll start with some lessons learned and showcase the power of strategic civic and political engagement. Then give a brief overview of what advocacy efforts look like and clear some common misconceptions. Then we'll discuss what role constituents like you play in advocacy spaces and larger spectrum of political and social change. For those of us who are newer to the scene, we'll give a quick look into the legislative process, touching on important points and tips to keep you in mind when engaged with elected officials and discussing how you can ensure your efforts make an impact. We will end finally with our training with a Q&A. So please be sure to make note of all your questions. Get a pen and paper out, or if you like the electronic version, so that you can remember what it is that you wanted to ask, and we'll get to them in the end. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? So before we delve into the different ways we can better ourselves and become better advocates and influence policy in Congress, it is important for us to have an understanding of where we stand as a community. And again, I think our representatives from CIOGC and Sister Shadden have kind of touched on the political engagement in Chicago, but I also wanted to give more in terms of a national report and also give a successful case study to kind of get us motivated and energized as well. So of course, our Muslim community is not a monolith, and every locale, every community has its unique conditions. However, there are studies and cases that we can learn from. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding actually shared a very powerful report not too long ago that is crucial, I think, in guiding our efforts as a collective. So here's what we've learned. Next slide. If you take a look at the report and the numbers, we find that we are actually a very active and civically engaged community. We've seen record turnout from the Muslim American community in the 2020 election year. We've also made considerable progress with voter engagement and voter registration. The ISPU also reports that regular mosque attendance is tied to greater civic engagement. And as someone who has led multiple voter engagement campaigns in my local community and was consistent in engaging our community members every Friday, every Jum'ah, I can confirm the great impact a well-organized and active mosque can have on the larger community. The report also found that American Muslims are mostly interested in domestic issues. And finally, while many of us tend to vote, especially during national elections, there's unfortunately a steady and small group of Muslim voters who do not vote for various reasons. And it's very important for us to be aware of that. Why, don't we, or that specific small group, why don't they vote? Why don't they turn out? Whether it's for national elections or local and state elections. One of the two main reasons is that they might not feel that the candidates reflect their priorities, that they don't feel represented by the candidates. And another reason is that they also might think that their voice does not matter. Their vote simply doesn't matter. So I just want us to keep that in mind as we move forward and talk more about advocacy to hopefully shift that narrative and move away from this mindset. Next slide. And I believe a slide before, slide 7. before that one.
Okay.
Awesome, thank you. And so with that in mind, it's also interesting to see that American Muslims are more likely than any other faith community to have attended a town hall meeting with their elected official in the past year. So we don't only vote, but we also engage in deeper civic engagement. And we see the same level of civic participation for campaign involvement as well. So this clearly shows that our community members go beyond casting their votes. We actually invest the time and energy to be civically engaged. Why is it then that these numbers are not reflected in governance and leadership? How can we ensure that we're not only participating in civic and political spaces, but also have an impact in amplifying our voices? And hopefully by the end of this training, we'll get an idea of how we can do that. Next slide.
That's a great question, Johanna. The American Muslim community engages in a deep civic participation. We are active and have the skills and talents and expertise to have a seat at the table and influence power structures, government and politics. However, the ISPU, as you'll see, reports that despite such involvement, representatives of Muslims in government fall short of American Muslim numbers in population. American Muslim socioeconomic capital and professional strengths are also not fully reflected in government and positions of power. While American Muslims make up an estimated 1% of the total US population, Muslims only make up 0.6% of congressional representation. American Muslim voices and concerns are not adequately addressed in government, which creates a need for better political representation and participation. What we need is increased strategic Muslim political and civic engagement, not only to increase the number of Muslims in elective office, but also to have American Muslim voices heard and influence policy on all government levels. And we hope that this training can provide a foundation for which we can achieve this. Next slide.
Thank you. So in addition to the powerful cases and success stories that we've seen coming from Chicago, I also want to briefly touch on a case study presented by the Institute in Virginia. The Virginia Muslim community has seen tremendous progress in the past years due to 4 key strategic elements, and all of these apply to congressional advocacy. The first is that we must have better, consistent relationships with our elected officials and engage with them on all levels of governance. If you think of Representative Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, they were both local and state elected officials before they ran for Congress. Their relationship with their constituency started years before they actually entered Congress. And so it's very important to harness those relationships and nurture those relationships before we have elected officials in Congress or in the administration on a national level. Another thing to keep in mind is that meeting your congressional member with a unified demand and a collective vision makes a greater impact. So we have to be united as much as possible as a Muslim community. And the member of Congress can't really grant individual wishes, but they're more inclined to move on an issue that is supported by a large group of people. And finally, the last point I want to highlight is that we also have an opportunity and should do more in terms of creating a pipeline of talent and leadership to ensure that our efforts never die. And this webinar is a great example of that. There are a lot of platforms out there, a lot of resources, a lot of educational materials that we can use to help develop leadership in our community. And it is our responsibility to grow our people power and give the younger generation the tools to be able to continue the work in the years to come. Next slide.
Now that we've learned that we must be more strategic about our civic and political engagement, and since we've established that advocacy is one of the most powerful tools in influencing positive change, how do we define advocacy? The term advocacy encompasses a broad range of activities, including research, public education, lobbying, and voter education that can influence public policy. Advocacy spaces are diverse and include a wide range of activities, expertise, areas of focus, and interests. Anyone can serve as an advocate, including you. Next slide. But why should you be an advocate? Why is advocacy important? Well, if you're a living, breathing person, you probably have some issues that you care about, that are important to you, that you want to fix and would like to protect. Whether you want to have a better education system for your kids, receive better health care, protect the civil and human rights of a specific community, whatever it is, advocacy is a powerful tool that can help you advance the issues you care about and making a lasting systemic change. Today, we're going to delve into how you can practice effective advocacy to shape the public debate on important social issues and to ensure that you have a voice in the policies that impact your life. Johanna, thank you.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And another win, huge win for the community that I would like to uplift during this webinar is, and I'm sure you've all heard, we've repealed the ban. The Muslim ban was reversed on day one of the new Biden administration. And the point that I would like to make here is that this victory is the culmination of 4 years of tireless advocacy efforts and community organizers. We owe this victory to the countless advocates and organizers who worked tirelessly to challenge this ban with every iteration, every new version. It developed into 2 bans. We've had the Muslim ban and the African ban, but we were tireless in our efforts. And that's how we reached that victory. So just to kind of uplift that, some challenges might be a little uphill, might take longer to achieve, but it's definitely possible. Next slide.
Yeah, so the Muslim ban that Johanna just mentioned was the result, as she said, of years of advocacy work, community organizing, national mobilization, and the fruit of collective effort, not just one-off individual efforts. Which brings me to a common misconception. Oftentimes, people refer to advocacy efforts as lobbying. It's important to note that while advocacy does, in fact, include lobbying, lobbying is only one form of advocacy. There are many avenues of advocacy that nonprofits and community members can engage in that do not involve lobbying. The advocacy efforts we witnessed in the fight to repeal the Muslim ban was centered more on the advocacy of the power of the people, including community leaders, lawyers, organizers, activists, and constituents like yourselves, and less on lobbying, actually. It's important to note that lobbying is often tied to big money. Next slide, please. Money in politics, as you'll see, is not the only factor influencing governance and policy. In addition to special interest groups such as lobbyists and big donors, elected officials and lawmakers are influenced by other party leaders and colleagues, media, and of course, electoral prospects, because most elected officials want re-election, obviously. Next slide. Thank you. So, while all of these factors have tremendous and heavy influence on politics and issues that impact our lives, we must not forget that constituents hold the power too. You have the power to put and keep elected officials in office. They are public servants that work for you to represent you. But in order to ensure such meaningful and reflective representation, we must utilize and seek to master the tools and avenues at our disposal. We must become better civic leaders and exercise strategic political engagement, including advocacy efforts. Next slide. Johanna.
Thank you. And so if you ever doubt your role as a constituent, I want you to reconsider the lens from which you are looking at your efforts. As someone who has worked in a congressional office and has been on the other side of the phone taking constituent calls and listening to the demands and concerns, I can assure you that your efforts are never a waste. The Congressional Management Foundation reports that direct constituent interactions have more influence on lawmakers' decisions than other strategies. So don't let lobbying and big money intimidate you. Next slide. The foundation also shows that direct constituent contact influences undecided lawmakers. And 79% of congressional staff believe personal stories help shape legislators' opinions. And again, I think Shadon gave us a wonderful example of how narrative can actually motivate and uplift advocacy work and organizing work. Next slide. So now that we've kind of covered the research-based evidence and proof that our voices matter and have the power to impact legislation and government, how do we turn our concerns and in many cases even frustrations into action? Two things to keep in mind when answering this question are there are different forms of advocacy, like Karimah mentioned, and they all go hand in hand. Again, it also might not be as easy. And as we've seen with the Muslim ban, it might take 4 years, but we'll eventually see the fruits of our labor, even if it means working tirelessly for years to come. Next slide.
The legislative branch, a refresher. Next slide, please. Before we delve into best practices and ways to build stronger relationships with your members in Congress, we must first understand the political moment we're in and have some familiarity with the institution we're engaging with. In this case, Congress. The House of Representatives has 433 members, one per district, elected every 2 years. The House also has a slim Democratic majority with 222 Democrats currently and 211 Republicans. The newly elected Congress has 100 members in the Senate, 2 per state, with 6-year terms. The Senate today has 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, leaving the Democrats with a slim majority with Vice President Harris as the tiebreaker. Next slide, please.
So out of these 533 congressional members, you need to know 3 important names: your 2 senators and your representative. For Illinois, we already know that we have Senators Durbin and Duckworth in the Senate. Your House representative, on the other hand, varies depending on the district you reside in, of course. And you can easily find that information on www.house.gov/find-my-representative. You just enter your zip code. It's a very simple, very useful directory. It will take you to either one representative, or it might give you the option, a couple of different options. In my case, I have 2 different representatives in my area, so you will have to insert your full address. And it's definitely one thing that I do appreciate about Congress is they're very helpful, like digital platforms, basically, in making our constituent lives very easier in terms of having everything online. Next slide. So now that we've covered how to even find who your member of Congress is, another thing that I think we should keep in mind is the internal structure of a congressional office. And Shadin might be able to speak about this a little more in detail towards the end. But this is a basic, I think, structure for any congressional office. It's important to note that while some congressional members do make the time, as we see in this case with Congresswoman Underwood, to actually meet with constituents and engage with the committee, it's not always very realistic to expect a meeting with your congressional member. In many cases, you will speak to a field representative if you're visiting the office, or be on the phone with an intern or staff assistant. But what's even more important to note is that your outreach efforts still count regardless of who you talk to. The intern or staff assistant you speak with will make a note of your call, and if you're asking the representative to vote on a bill, they will tally up the constituent calls in favor and in opposition of the bill to inform the member before they vote. The member of Congress will most likely take that into consideration when voting, especially if they have a strong relationship with their constituents and are held accountable to that constituency. And so we just wanted to give you a brief overview of what that looks like. You've got the staff assistant, the intern, we have the scheduler, all the different legislative aides and director. If you are in the district office, you will also see a district director and field representatives, and then of course the chief of staff in DC and your congressional member. Next slide.
So you can use this to explain the legislative process. As you can see here on the graph, the bill is introduced, either in either House of Congress. It's sent to the committee, and then the House votes, Senate and House bills are reconciled. Finally, the president signs or vetoes the bill. Next slide.
Thank you. So now that we've covered the basics, how do we actually contact our members of Congress? I just wanted to kind of give a few quick tips in terms of how do we even communicate with our congressional members. And there are different ways, of course. So in terms of calling them or emailing your congressional member, as I've mentioned before, you can easily find your member or senator at the House and Senate websites that we've got linked on the slide. You can also call them at the number that we have provided on the slide that provides basically a switchboard operator that will take you to your specific representative or senator. But the three most important parts is that once you do get to the congressional office, that you identify yourself as a constituent. The staff talking to you will make a note of your message and make sure that your message gets to the member of Congress once you identify yourself as a constituent. You must also prepare a script, so keep it short, one issue per email or call. Explain why the issue is important to you. As Shadon mentioned, and as we've seen with all the different statistics, personal narratives are very powerful and very important to highlight as well. So feel free to add a couple of sentences on how the issue impacts you as a constituent, as a person, while keeping in mind that if you're calling, you don't want to take more than a minute or two to basically talk about the issue. And I think Karimah has actually a great way of describing this elevator pitch and some tips on how to draft one.
Yeah, so I have a lot of background in getting messages across really quickly to people who don't have time. So I really suggest this, and it's just good communication practice in general. Start with the elevator pitch, get it practiced and down. And why do we say an elevator pitch? Because you imagine yourself stepping into an elevator with somebody that is the most important person you're supposed to talk to in your whole life, and the most important message you've got to get across in your whole life. And you have this one opportunity to stand in this elevator and give this message to the person, but you have to get it to them before they get off at their floor. Some people say 30 seconds. So let's just say 30 seconds. Let's say you have 30 seconds to get your idea to this person. So develop this elevator pitch, which gets everything out that you want to say in 30 seconds and convinces that person, has the details and the swaying argument, all of it encapsulated within 30 seconds. And that's what you start with every time. You get that 30 seconds out, you've already gotten their attention and you've already gotten the main point across. And then any extra time you have after that, that they're willing to listen or able to listen, that's gravy. That's just extra. You can add the extra information and details that you need. But just know that these people, their time is very valuable. They have very little time, and you want to get that straight out the door as quickly as possible. So that's my suggestion to everybody. Always have an elevator pitch that can be done in 30 seconds.
Get us back to our conversation. This was actually perfect because we were talking about a great elevator pitch, and I think Congresswoman Underwood came and gave her amazing, uplifting elevator pitch and how we can strategically contact our congressional members and have an impact. The only thing I would add to what we already mentioned, first, we talked about identifying yourself as a constituent, prepare a script, your talking points, a personal story or narrative very briefly in a couple of sentences, as Karimah mentioned, but also make sure that you have a clear ask. I think if you leave with anything from this training is that you need to be very clear about what you are asking. What are your demands? If you present a story, if you talk about a general issue without having a very specific demand of your congressional member, there isn't much that they can do about it, right? So you want to make it easier for them. I think Congresswoman Underwood also brought up a very, very good point, is that in a lot of these cases, and in a lot, as an impacted person, in a lot of those situations, you are the expert. You bring the expertise. You know more about the issue. And as organizers, we always say the people closest to the issue are the people closest to the solution. So you know more about the issue than the congressperson, most probably. And in terms of staffers, they will do their research if they're already championing the issue, but you bring a lot to the table. So don't forget that. And she also mentioned that, and we have it on the slide, be sure to mention a bill with the number. So the name of the bill, for instance, HR1 for the People Act is the name, and then HR1 is the number, if you have a bill that you are referring to. But I'll keep it at that. Next slide, please. So here for our next slide, I just wanted to give you an example of a very brief script that we've had this past summer in 2020, around the time we were mobilizing to get votes for the No Ban Act in the House of Representatives. And as you can see, it's only a couple of paragraphs, very straight to the point, simple. So just wanted to give you an idea of what that looks like in writing if you are drafting your script before calling. If you are sending out an email, you have more, you have an opportunity to delve more into the details. You can provide up to 1 page, but again, you have to be specific, concise, and very clear in terms of what you're asking of your congressional member. Next slide. And now one of the most important reminders is to always follow up. Whether you're calling, emailing, visiting, or getting on a virtual meeting with your congressional member, it's very important to follow up all the time. And you start with thanking the staff, you start with thanking the congressional member for meeting with you, listening to you. The next step would be to also track the bill and track the issue as well, so that you remain informed and updated on what's happening in Congress. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that as a constituent, but don't shy away from asking the congressional staff for resources and information as well, if that would help you track the issue in Congress. And the third point is that you also need to take advantage of their time in the district and recess. So whenever your congressional member is on recess or is back in the district, make sure that you meet with them. We used to have a lot of those meetings pre-COVID. Now everything has shifted virtually, and you can find more information on how to contact your representative on Zoom or any other virtual platform that they use on their website. And the last important point is that you should never give up. Try again. We've mentioned this earlier, and I'll mention it again. Some change is harder to achieve than other changes. It might take up to 4 years, or it might take a month to get something passed in Congress. Or maybe sometimes you are talking to your congressional member about an issue that doesn't necessarily have a piece of legislation around it. You might be that one person to spark that idea or thought for them to introduce a bill around the issue that impacts you or your community. So keep trying until you reach that goal, or you feel that you're happy with the accomplishments that you've made. Next slide. And so I will pass it now to Karimah to talk about the impact and kind of give us a little example of what that looks like.
Absolutely. Thank you, Johanna. So numbers, people. And as the Congresswoman said, she wants to hear your voices. Everybody wants to hear your voice. She wants everyone else to hear your voices, because that's how change is going to happen. I believe Johanna said it several times now, numbers make a difference. So here's an example just for your, just to think about. So if you put in 5 calls or 5 people put in calls, puts your policy issue on the agenda. If you put in 7 calls or 7 people put in calls, keeps your policy issue on the agenda. And more than 10 calls, preferably many more, will put your issue at the top of the agenda at the next staff meeting. So numbers matter. Get out there, get your friends, get your family members, get on Twitter, get people calling this number. Put out the numbers of your representatives and the Congress people and get everybody you know calling, and we'll really make a change. It's just that easy, guys.
Thank you.
Johanna.
Next slide, please. And so I kind of touched on bill tracking a couple of seconds ago. This is just wanted, we have a screenshot of congress.gov, which is a website you can go to basically track any piece of legislation that you're interested in. Of course, you would have to know of that bill before you go to the website. If you're not aware, let's say you have a specific issue, whether it's like around healthcare, any domestic issues, or even foreign policy, let's say if you're interested around any legislation on the war in Yemen, for instance, but you're not aware of any bills or legislation around it, you can call the congressional office, your rep in Congress, and ask the staff member that you're talking to about any bills around that specific issue, and they'll be able to guide you through that process, hopefully. And so once you get that name of the bill, and I have here for the People Act, because Polygon is advocating for the specific legislation at the time, and it's basically a bill for around democracy reform. I'm not going to get too much into it, but feel free to look into it later on. We have a lot of resources on our website. So if you put the name of the bill, HR 1 for the People Act, you will get a brief summary. I really think, again, this website does a great job in terms of outlining the timeline. So as you can see right now, it's introduced in the House. And you see all the different committees or all the different stages before it can turn into law. So yes, please track legislation on congress.gov, either before meeting with your representative or even after, if you learn of the bill after meeting with them, so that you're up to date and aware. Next slide. So we kind of also talked about office visits very briefly. It's very similar to calling or emailing with a couple of differences. So again, you can schedule your meeting online. Of course, do your research, track any bills, do the research on any bills that you are mentioning. Feel free to reach out to experts in the community as well. Feel free to reach out to Polygon or any other institution that is focusing on specific bills or issues that impact you or you're interested in, to get kind of some talking points going. Also look into whether your congressional member is already sponsoring the bill. And you can find that information on congress.gov, the website that I just mentioned. You can see if they are co-sponsors or not, if they're supporting or not. Also look into whether they made a statement about that specific issue or that specific piece of legislation. All of these will help inform how you approach your representative and how you frame your talking points, right? Because that's very important at the end of the day, is how we talked about the elevator pitch, but we also need to talk about messaging and how to frame the issue. And once you've got all of that covered, of course, and the day comes for your meeting, be sure to organize yourselves. So hopefully you're not going in alone. We recommend that you try to go in with other constituents, with allies, coalition members, experts. Again, reach out to those who have connections, who are already doing advocacy work, to help you organize the meeting and have a larger impact. So you would need the facilitator, a personal story, a personal narrative that really can amplify why you need to change that specific issue and how it impacts you or your community members. And then specific talking points, be as specific as possible. When we say talking points, try to put all of your talking points in one page. And as advocacy experts, we usually have those one pagers ready when we go and meet with congressional members for them. Again, just want to remind everyone that you are the expert. As advocacy experts, we're the experts on issues that we prioritize. So for instance, for the Muslim community, as a constituent, you are the expert on whatever issue impacts you as a person. And so having those outlined in a one pager is very important because it will also help inform the staffers and give them an idea of what you're talking about. And of course, the ask, we talked about it, have a very specific demand. After the meeting, it's very important to debrief, take notes, reflect on what you've learned, and also keep a note of any next steps. So if they asked you any questions during the meeting and that require follow-up, you would need to follow up on those. And debriefing also helps you identify whether you need to do more research, apply more pressure, go in with larger numbers than next time, maybe lead a petition. So it kind of informs your strategy and how you are advocating for that specific issue. And of course, we talked about following up. So follow up, thank you, send a thank you immediately after the meeting, share your contact information so they can also follow up with you on any updates, and reach out to them whenever there are any updates. Next slide. So the last thing that I would like to touch on, which is kind of different in terms of outreach and contacting your congressional members, it also kind of has very similar tips, but obviously a town hall meeting is different from an office visit in that you get a larger number of community members attending, different issues are brought to the table and are on the agenda, not just your issue. So there's a chance for you to also learn from others and what they're talking about. Whenever speaking, introduce yourself as a constituent, why this issue matters to you. Again, thank your member for listening and for joining the town hall meeting. Tell a brief story, make a clear direct ask, and follow up. So I think those are very consistent tips that we see with every outreach or every correspondence, whether it's a call, an email, an office visit, virtual meeting, or even a town hall. It just differentiates a little bit because the means are different or the avenues are different. And so I would like to wrap us up with a couple of reminders. Next slide, please. You got this. I think we've been saying this since we've started the training. You have the power, you have the advantage, and your Congress member works for you. One thing to remember again is that you are the expert, even if you don't really identify as a policy expert, as a constituent, as someone who has lived experiences tied to the issue you're talking about. You are the expert and you bring a lot of valuable assets to the table. So please don't shy away from sharing those. Reach out for help whenever you need it. Reach out to your local masjid, mosque, reach out to advocacy experts, to professionals, to leaders. There are no limits to who can help you in terms of advocacy, really. And it's not just, advocacy spaces aren't only for advocacy experts or policy experts like myself. Anyone can be part of an advocacy space. And show up with numbers. We've also highlighted that point multiple times. Next slide. All right, and so before we wrap it up and move on to Q&A, again, remember that you have allies. So work closely with other community members, with friends, build coalition with others outside of the impacted community who are non-Muslims maybe, or whatever you consider as an impacted community. Just build coalition and relationships with others in your locale. Stay on message, stay united, try as much as I know it might seem difficult sometimes to unite on a specific vision, but try your best to have that collective vision for the future you're seeking, whether on a specific bill or just as a larger collective, and stay on that message, stay consistent so that when you go and address the issue with your congressional member, they're not receiving different thoughts and ideas and asks from your neighbor, right? We all want to have that same ask. And the last reminder is that we will win. You know, we've been winning, we have a lot of victories, we have been making a lot of progress. So, you know, with more of these webinars, more education, spreading the word, networking, leadership development, and more strategic organizing and more strategic advocacy work, we will win. But yeah, that's it. You can find us for the next slide. We have our contact information, so you can find us on social media. Feel free to reach out on our website or at via email.